In 1840, a number of women from America and around the world traveled to London to take part in the World Anti-Slavery Convention, but were denied entry based on their sex. Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Women who were trying to fight for the rights of others were denied a seat at the table because of who they were. But this also made it so that a bunch of women who cared about social change were now together in one spot. By 1851, Stanton met Susan B. Anthony and they began the fight for women's right to vote. All around the world, women were fighting for the right to have a seat at the table.
Back in Queen Victorian times, women weren't allowed to vote, even though we had a female king. So some women formed a gang called the Suffragettes.
But like any social change, they had an uphill battle. And that's especially true if it's a social change that makes white men have to share their toys, as seen by these anti-suffrage posters. Apparently, the worst thing imaginable to these men is doing household chores. Which is ironic because by saying that, they are admitting that stay-at-home mothers do a lot of work and are an integral part of society. So they're kind of arguing that maybe they should have equal rights because they work just as hard as them. But like modern little baby boys, they worry that sharing any rights or privileges will emasculate them.
Terry, your reaction.
It's pathetic, right? And this is what the lie of feminism has always been about, right? They told us that it was about equality for women and to elevate women. Charlie, you and I both know very well that it's always just been about tearing down men and removing them from society. Mm-hmm. Every goal of the feminist movement, ever since they got, the right to vote, after that, it all went downhill, right?
It's a couple of whiny little babies right there. So like these posters and like this little boy here, the argument is rarely about the bad things women do, but about how the only way these boys can feel like big, strong men is if they push women down.
The feminist lie has been that patriarchy is bad. It is tyrannical. It is toxic. It needs to be destroyed. And they've been doing it for decades. To destroy masculinity, to destroy strong male leadership and character leads to the current disaster.
Two dead guys in a row. I guess the feminists are winning. If the only way that you can feel strong and masculine is by pushing women down, you were never strong or masculine to begin with. But nevertheless, she persisted. By the 20th century, change was on the horizon. This map from a 1917 women's suffrage newsletter shows the progress in North America by that point. Later that same year, Canada granted women the right to vote. Well, white women. Japanese Canadians weren't granted the right to vote until 1948, and Indigenous peoples were not allowed to vote without giving up their treaty rights until 1960. In 1918, British women were allowed to vote, as well as Germany. By 1919, Austria and Netherlands followed suit, and in 1920, the United States passed the 19th Amendment. Again, it was just for white women, and it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that states were not allowed to discriminate based on race when it came to voting. But today, almost every country in the world, with the exception of 3, allow women to vote. But now there are a bunch of whiny little boys who think this is a bad idea. Because what is more manly than blaming women for all your problems? Hey everybody, thank you so much for liking and subscribing and commenting and all the other awesome stuff you do because of how awesome that you are. I put the links down below for the social media, for the Patreon, for the merch, for my personal phone number is hidden in a code. And if you crack the code, you can send me a text. There hasn't been a time in the history of democracy where people haven't been actively trying to make it harder for certain people to vote. Things like poll taxes, which were designed to further disenfranchise marginalized groups. And literacy tests, which again were made to disenfranchise marginalized groups. Gerrymandering, which is still going on, and all the nonsense that Georgia pulled in 2021.
Georgia just made it harder to vote. Republican Governor Brian Kemp signed sweeping legislation late today that restricts voting. As so many people have pointed out, the picture of the 7 white men at the bill signing probably tells us everything we need to know about what Republicans in Georgia have just done and why. The new law adds an ID requirement for absentee voting. The New York Times goes on to say it introduces a raft of new restrictions for voting and elections in the state, including limiting drop boxes, stripping the Secretary of State of some of his authority, imposing new oversight of county election boards, restricting who can vote with provisional ballots, and making it a crime to offer food or water to voters waiting in lines.
Now, is that last part right? Actually, yes. Georgia's governor signed this law back in March 2021, and you can see it says no person can give gifts to people who are standing in line to vote, and that includes food and water. And yes, people caught violating this law could face 12 months in jail or a $1,000 fine. Now, Republicans say this law will help prevent outside groups from influencing people while they're in line, but Democrats say it'll make the experience harder for people who have to wait in long lines and potentially just discourage them from voting. Voting right.
And this happens because the people with power, people with privilege, they start really hating democracy. It's usually the same people who scream that they love freedom that also hate that people have freedom. And they actively work to try to make sure that certain people who disagree with them don't have a say. They believe that they are better. They believe that they should have more of a say in how their countries are run.
In states, you've seen 17 states pass 28 laws. Generally, advocates are saying making voting rights harder and restricting access to voting. Whereas in a lot of Democratic states or Democratic-controlled states, you're seeing voting rights access be expanded. In states like California and New York, certain reforms are going in place in historically restricted places that are now becoming easier for, say, vote by mail, for instance, in New York. Whereas states like Texas, Arizona, Georgia, Florida, Wyoming, Utah have passed laws that have restricted access to, say, on policies, say, so-called ballot harvesting or restricting Sunday voting or making it harder to access things like resources in line as you wait in states like Georgia, restricting early voting periods. In light of the 2020 election and seeing the aftermath of that, both parties have started to see voting as the big issue that is necessary to their coalition's political success.
And of course, a lot of the voter suppression laws that popped up in 2021 were because of Trump's loss. They used a false narrative about election fraud to further disenfranchise people. And they're still trying this now, even though Trump is back in office with the SAVE Act.
While the specific policies may have changed since the days of the Jim Crow South, the goal of the SAVE Act is the same: disenfranchising American citizens and making it harder for eligible people to vote.
He says all this before probably voting for it in the name of unity or something, but he's right.
It's already the law that if you want to participate in federal elections, you need to be an American citizen. But this week, the House of Representatives is set to vote on legislation that would require proof via documents of citizenship when registering to vote, as well as require a form of photo ID when going to the polls. The legislation has been a rallying cry for conservatives for years, as well as for President Trump, who is actively lobbying Congress for election changes. On Truth Social this weekend, the president writing, quote, "I'm asking all Republicans to fight for the following: Save America Act. 1. All voters must show voter ID. 2. All voters must show proof of United States citizenship to register for voting. 3. No mail-in ballots." Democrats and progressive groups are actively fighting against the bill, arguing that citizenship proof at voter registration isn't practical for many. Democracy Docket reports, quote, "At least 21.3 million voters, around 9% American citizens of voting age, lack ready access to such documents, according to the Brennan Center for Justice analysis. If the legislation clears the House this week, its future in the Senate is murky at best, with Republicans likely needing to change filibuster rules in order for it to pass.
When my driver's license was expiring in 2012, my choices were either to renew it for $60 or have food that week. I didn't drive. At that point in my life, my driver's license was also my only form of ID. For a lot of low-income people, getting a photo ID can be very difficult, and finding the documentation to show that you are a legal citizen can be very difficult because each step in that process usually costs money. So then they're met with the decision of, do I vote or do I eat? And a lot of people choose to eat because that's what keeps you alive. They choose to feed their families because that's what keeps their families alive. There has been no evidence of widespread voter fraud in the US, but they use that as an excuse to make it harder for people to vote. In 2016, before the presidential election, polls were predicting that more women would vote for Hillary and more men would vote for Trump. So on Twitter, the hashtag repeal the 19th Amendment started trending. And at the time, people couldn't figure out if this was a joke or if people were being serious. And no, it was not a joke. People actually voted for the guy from The Apprentice and the WWE. But also the hashtag thing. That was also not a joke.
2 days ago, Nate Silver's 538 blog, a polls and number-based political publication, tweeted election maps. Did you see this? Separated by gender. One of them was titled, "If Only Men Voted," showed a landslide victory in red for Donald Trump. Soon after, the repeal the 19th hashtag popped up, talking about the 19th Amendment that gives women the right to vote. Some people seemed serious about it. Others seemed to be mocking the idea, using the hashtag ironically. Here's one from a woman who describes herself as a Trump supporter. She wrote, "I would be willing to give up my right to vote to make this happen. Hashtag repeal the 19th. Joining me now, a journalist who's covering this for the LA Times, political reporter Seema Mehta. Nice to see you, Seema.
You too. Thank you.
So we wondered when we started seeing this Twitter hashtag, was it real? Was it ironic? Was it a joke? What did you find?
I think it's a combination of all of the above. I mean, what struck me at first, there were some people who legitimately were saying, hashtag repeal the 19th, saying, hey, if we get rid of women voters, he'll go on to victory. But then a lot more people started using this as a way to get their message out, whether it was people who don't support Trump saying, using it to say, hey, look at what some of his supporters stand for, or even people who have nothing to do with the message, just using it because it was trending across the country and it was just attracting so much attention.
In 2016, though, most of these little guys typing repeal the 19th Amendments were hiding behind their screens. But 10 years later, we know that a lot of them were very serious, and we know that this idea is spreading.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth recently made headlines when he shared a CNN video on social media about the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, an arch-conservative network of Christian congregations where he's a member. The video included its pastors arguing women should not have the right to vote.
Women obviously have a higher capacity for empathy than men. But that empathy can be manipulated into giving empathy for people who don't deserve it. And that's a problem. And they can be manipulated into doing things that are not in their best interest. And that's why, Greg, I want our audience to consider amending the 19th Amendment.
Well, men have a higher capacity for douchebaggery, as evidenced by that outfit. I should mention that it is not only men.
Savannah Stone is a 21-year-old trad wife influencer.
I don't think that traditional housewives did press tours and speaking engagements, but I could be wrong about that.
With 800,000 followers on social media. She is a rising star in Christian conservative circles, even though she embraces highly controversial fringe positions.
I'm going to start this off really strong. I don't think women should vote anyways. If somebody asked me, if the government was like, okay, if we could have a more conservative country, if all women gave up their vote, I would gladly give up my right to vote to have a more conservative country.
There's a lot of churches that talk about it.
Stone argues that women voters are too liberal, so the U.S. should shift to a one vote per household system.
But that's what it comes down to. This group of people doesn't vote the way I like, so I'm going to try to stop this group of people from voting. And they aren't even hiding this fact.
Why would you want to remove, just from yourself, the right to vote?
Well, what happened was I had the same view, right? Back when I started, I was like, why? I found out that only 5% of women wanted the right to vote. And I couldn't figure out, why would women not? No, it's true. It's true.
At
you look it up.
At the time?
At the time.
Because they've been conditioned by men to think that they shouldn't have a vote.
I mean, that's what they say. But, I started reading their writings, right? And what I found out was that the reason a lot of women advocated for it was because they believed it was the beginning of the breakdown of the family. Before you became one in marriage, 85% of people were married. And, I hate to say it, but they were right. What has happened 100 years later?
But what's that got to do with them having the vote?
Well, it also goes back to responsibility. Again, men are 80 to 90% of the military. They run all of the infrastructures that make society run. So I just think if we want an equal say in society, then be equal. Do 50% of the hard jobs. Be 50% of the military. In the U.S., they're fined $250,000 if they don't join selective service, which is essentially the draft.
Okay, it seems to me like these women hate women. Like they hate themselves. Some would call them pick-me's. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that because I'm a man, but some people would say that.
Pearl, what are you doing? Like, seriously. Next question.
Let's be honest, the trouble all started when women were allowed to vote. Wow. You got it wrong.
You got it wrong.
Did I? Okay.
Yes,
All
you
right.
did. And that is because I do think that there have been a lot of problems with women being able to vote. Absolutely. But it started a lot earlier than that. It started with a woman being deceived by the snake. That's where it started.
Do you remember a time when chocolate chip cookies came fresh from the oven? Petridge Farm remembers.
Oh, those were the days.
Do you remember a time when women couldn't vote and certain folk weren't allowed on golf courses? Petridge Farm remembers.
These are conservative women in conservative spaces, and the current conservative climate is all about men and all about the patriarchy. So these women adapt to maintain their audience.
I actually do agree with her. I would as well give up my vote if it got rid of things like abortion.
We spoke with several women open to giving up their own rights in pursuit of a more Christian conservative America.
My perspective as a Christian woman is that my husband and I are one flesh. I vote the same way he does, so honestly, I would be okay with giving up my right to vote because I know that he would represent me well.
If my husband's the head of the household, I am the neck.
Chicken necks!
And we work very cohesively together, so I would imagine if he was voting on behalf of our household, I would be fine with that.
Do you think your daughter should have the right to vote?
I'd be okay if she didn't, because I also know she's going to marry a biblical man, that they would also be in line.
But the vast majority of women here say this remains a conversation for the fringe.
I think the best thing that we can do is hold conferences like this to educate liberal women and hopefully sway them to the conservative side.
I think women should be voting.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to give up my right to vote ever.
And yes, it is still a fringe idea. That is true. And that is the number one reason why I get brushed off when I talk about this. Yeah, some people are saying that. Yeah, some people think that, but it's not going to happen. But the problem is that most ideas start as fringe ideas and grow from there. And just because an idea isn't the most popular idea right now doesn't mean that it is not dangerous. And it's a growing idea in a lot of Christian conservative churches and online spaces.
Is it good that women can vote in America?
Yes. Yes, it is.
I don't think so, and here's why. Nearly every legalized moral atrocity of the last 100 years was made possible by the female vote.
Really? Japanese internment camps, Jim Crow laws, McCarthyism, ignoring the AIDS crisis, lying about weapons of mass destruction, helping Israel do a genocide, overthrowing countless world leaders for economic gain, helping in other genocides. That was all done because women were allowed to vote?
Abortion and homosexuality would likely still be illegal if not for the female vote.
Oh, okay, those good things that happened. He thinks that a pregnant person's right to choose what they do with their own body and gay people simply being allowed to exist should still be illegal. And he's not saying he wants gay marriage to be illegal. He wants homosexuality to be illegal. He wants it to be illegal to be gay.
Mass immigration in the welfare state rode on the backs of the female vote.
Mass immigration of the welfare state. Okay, first of all, welfare exists because greed exists. The greed of men, of rich men. not the greed of the people using the welfare programs. Social safety nets exist primarily to start because of the Great Depression. The Great Depression happened because of greedy businessmen. People still rely on social safety nets because of the greed of billionaires and CEOs. If people received a fair wage, a lot less people would be on social assistance programs. But he's lumping it in with immigration to tap into the right's hate for what they call welfare queens, a made-up trope about people who are living the high life by mooching off the government, which again is something that only applies to billionaires.
Nearly every modern Democrat, including Obama and Biden, were elected because of the female vote. Even last night, the new Muslim New York City mayor, Mondami, won specifically because of the female vote.
So it just comes down to him not liking that his side is losing, so he tries to take the ball and go home. But all he seems to be showing is that women are way smarter than men.
Now, you've called for repealing women's right to vote, which is protected by the 19th Amendment.
Right.
Why?
Because it's a good idea.
Hilarious. Get this guy on the Tonight Show. Maybe Johnny will ask him over to the couch afterwards.
No,
a lot of women wouldn't think so.
A lot of women wouldn't agree. All right. But this is one of my favorite questions now, too. Mm-hmm. This is not an XXXY chromosome issue.
Mm-hmm.
It is. It 100% is a sexist belief, but they have to disguise it for now.
Because I don't want women voting as individuals, because I don't want men voting as individuals. So what I envision is a system that we have practiced in our church here for 4 decades, and that is household voting.
It's not about women. It's not about taking the vote away from women. It's about restoring the family. It's bad that women can vote because it divides the family.
Well, that's the thing is I really did mean that. Like I want to have the kind of unity with my wife.
That's right.
That where we would actually discuss it. So if she felt really, really strongly about something, and then by the way, I think Pastor Doug mentioned this in his follow-up post, but we do household voting in our churches, and so we're trying to practice this and work this out in our churches. And we only our congregations vote for elders and deacons, vote for officers, but those votes are cast by household, which includes single women households, widowed houses, and so on. So women do vote, but we vote as households. But the principle is not simply, we don't think it's just like mostly men should vote. It's actually an opportunity to practice true representation, which means that what we want our people doing, and especially when you have men as male heads of households, but the same thing would apply for, a woman who has minor children at home. Like she ought to go home and we want to have discussions with our people.
So in this model, they believe that the man is the head of the household. They hate single mothers, unless they're widows, and they don't recognize gay or lesbian marriages.
With obviously no-fault divorce and Obergefell and the nature of that union, the head-body reality that's present. And again, that's a foreign language to those who are in the secular world. But this is not like the Reformed and Evangelical Church out in Moscow. This is called like Christianity from the beginning till now.
Right.
This is what marriage is. The Apostle Paul, marriage has this representative character.
No-fault divorce doesn't mean that it wasn't anyone's fault or that there was no abuse or no infidelity. It just means you don't have to prove it in court. You don't have to prove that you were abused in order to get away from your abuser, which is a really good thing because it allows more abused people to get away from their abuser. Because how do you prove something like verbal abuse or emotional abuse? How do you prove sexual or physical abuse when they are careful not to leave marks? No-fault divorce saves lives. Also, these are supposed to be the small government people, but they want them telling people who they have to be married to. Straight people have to stay with their abusers, and in most cases, the abuser is the one that would have the vote for both of them. A gay person can't marry the person they love. So I guess in that case, they would each get a vote? Or do they want only married and widowed people to be allowed to vote in this system? Because the system is pretty convoluted.
Okay, so in our polity, in our church system, The congregation votes on the installation of deacons and elders and calling a pastor. Those are the areas where the church exercises its voice. And when we hold a church election for an elder, about 7% of the votes are cast by women, because we have a number of women who are heads of their households. And when a young man, let's say a college student, moves to Moscow, and he's 19 years old, and he's going to college, and he wants to become a member, we interview him, and one of the things we ask is, who's paying for your school? And if his folks back home are putting him through school, we bring him into membership, but he's a non-voting member because he's not a household.
A single person is only a voting member if their parents aren't paying for school. But what about if they're on student loans? What if they got a scholarship, but their parents would have paid for their school otherwise? What about someone who's not a student, but their parents are paying their way? What about somebody who has a trust fund? Does that count as their parents paying their way, or does that count as their own money? What if somebody is married, but their parents help them financially?
But with the concept of headship within your church, which is households led by men.
When there's a man.
There's a man. That would mean the vote would ultimately be decided by the head of the household.
Well, the vote would be decided, the vote would be cast by the head of the household. By the head of the household.
Which would typically be
the man.
The man.
Right. And when it isn't, and in our church, we have a number of households headed by women. And when they head the household, they vote. So it's
okay. So I got this idea, and it's just like a brainwave I have. I've maybe had to streamline this a bit. Instead of figuring out what a household is and who the head of that household is, what if you were to give everyone who is over the age of 18 the right to vote, regardless of their race, gender, or marital status? That way, the government isn't all up in our business, and you can just vote without having to prove that you're the head of a household.
Never want to do anything that my wife completely disagrees with. And that's never the goal, to drag her through. Now, once in a rare situation, do you have to go, I'm sorry, I'm making a choice that you don't agree with, but it's the right choice? Sure, that happens in marriage. But my goal is that we're one on everything, on politics, on finance, on parenting, on theology, on whatever, right? Education. And so it's my job to shepherd her lovingly, as Christ does, to those positions. And so that there really is no problem.
It's one body. It's united. You mentioned I like your political Pelagianism. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, I wrote that down.
But I was thinking this is kind of the idea that women have to have the vote because there might be differences of opinion. There might be disagreement, which was the follow-up question that Mrs. Brown asked me. But it's like an electoral prenup. It's like, why do you sign a prenuptial agreement? It's because you kind of think this is probably not going to work out. And but that's what this is. Like this is the equivalent of electoral prenup. You're probably not going to agree. You're probably not going to have the same opinion. So both of you better vote. But that's why I think, well, I don't think that's the best setup. I think that's teaching, like in the same way that I wouldn't encourage people to sign prenuptial agreements. Like you're leaning in a direction of like assuming this is not going to work out.
Here's the thing. I think it's weird to be in a relationship with somebody who has very different political views than you, especially in this day and age. Especially with most political differences nowadays being about human rights. But I get that some people are with people they disagree with. People change over time, and I understand that some people don't want to bail immediately just because they've grown apart in certain areas. And I also understand that some people are stuck in marriages, sometimes to, say, a right-wing pastor or a controlling religious husband. In those cases, at least those people have their own voice in the voting booth. This way, maybe they could tell their husband that, hey, I'm actually voting for the guy you want me to vote for. But then once they get in the booth, they could vote differently. And that way, they at least have a voice. On the other hand, if they do agree, there's 2 votes that agree with you. Good job, you did it.
And people are like, that's so archaic. You're a Neanderthal. You're so, primitive and chauvinistic. You won't let women vote. Well, our society doesn't let 5-year-olds vote yet. I pray that it, that it stays that way. But we don't let children. Yes. We don't let children vote, and it's not just because of competency, because that would be the immediate counter as well. But their brain isn't fully developed, and so are you saying that a woman is like a child? Yes. But not intellectually. I'm not saying that. The question is how. In what way is a woman like a child? She is like a child in the way that God has appointed men to protect them. Women are not supposed to be leading the way.
I'm not saying she's intellectually like a child. I'm saying we should treat her like a child. She's smarter than you, because who isn't? But you're still going to treat her like a child because of God.
My perspective on the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage.
Okay, first of all, clear your throat before you go live, or just have the mute button ready. Okay, come on, Pale Millhouse. This is not a great start.
Is that the problem with women's suffrage is that it reinforces the liberal idea that the individual is the core unit of society, not the family. Because the Catholic social teaching tells us that the family is the core unit of society, we ought to have a family vote. Now, this means that I'm not actually in favor of repealing the 19th as such. I'm in favor of repealing individual vote as a total and having a family vote, and allowing each family to decide on in what manner they do that family voting on their own. If whoever in the family wants to make that, that's fine, but it should be a family vote.
What about cultures where multiple generations live under the same roof? What about single people? What about polycules? What about a situation where the child is the main breadwinner? This all sounds like it would be a logistical nightmare. But they don't care about that because, of course, they don't want family voting. They want women to not vote.
So let us talk about women voting, shall we? Back in the bad old days, before the 19th Amendment, the men were considered to be the heads of their households and represented their families at the ballot box.
Except for it's not 1920s anymore, is it, Dougie? No, it's 2026. And some households don't even have a man in it, do they? And some households have two men and they kiss each other.
Things are exactly the way they were back in 1817, except, women and minorities can vote, we have indoor toilets, and we no longer burn widows for learning arithmetic.
So what happened when their wives were granted suffrage? Let us take a typical presidential election to illustrate it, using the first one in 1920 after women's suffrage was accomplished, the election between Warren Harding and James Cox. If both the husband and wife vote for Harding, say, then what you have done is simply multiply the number of total votes cast for him by 2. And if the husband votes for Harding, say, and the wife votes for Cox.
So I don't know if you noticed this, but he just said Cox. That's funny.
Then what you've done is cancel out the voice of that particular household. Upon discovering how they were each going to vote, what would be the harm if the two of them just stayed home for a quiet dinner together in order to cancel out one another's vote that way? Where was the great progress supposed to be located? The net effect of women's suffrage was not an advance in women's rights, but rather part of a push to replace covenanted entities, like families, with raw individualism.
If a 1920s woman is going to vote in a different way than her husband, she's probably not going to tell him that. It finally gave a voice to someone who previously had no say.
The reason why I have grown to despise democracy is because it's not we the people. It's we the some people. And who are those people? Non-elected officials. Yep. Like what democracy, what it gives, lends its strength to is instead of having elected officials that have power, is a raw universal, because that's what we have is a universal democracy. Everyone is allowed to vote. Right. Everyone. And just for the record, I think the 19th Amendment should be repealed. I think that because, well, first and foremost, because I'm a Christian, and that is the Christian position. Oh my gosh.
Well, a lot of Christians are perfectly okay with the 19th Amendment. But I guess if you aren't sexist, then you aren't a real Christian, according to him. And I see this so much. If you don't believe the exact same stuff as me, you aren't really a Christian.
You're saying that, yes, that is the Christian position, is that households should not be divided against one another. So it's not just elevating a male vote but it's elevating the household vote. We're saying that that society, if you break it down to the basic building block, is not atomistic as individuals, but molecular, being households. That the way that God sees humanity is He breaks them down to families, and so that it's not just random individual atoms all bouncing around together, and 350 million atoms bouncing together in one nation.
So that metaphor went all over the place. It was kind of bouncing around like an atom, wasn't it?
On one piece of land, but it's families. And so by repealing the 19th Amendment, just for the record, it's not just trying to take away a female vote, but it's trying to say, no, there's a family vote. Right. There's a household. And it's like, well, where do women get their voice? Where women get their voice is from their father, from their husband. If they're not married, it's from their father. If they're not married and their father is dead, it's from their brother, it's from their uncle, it's the men in their lives that love them.
What are you guys doing here?
Oh, just arguing about America. Did you know that the Sarge doesn't think we should have given women the right to vote?
That is not true.
Oh, sure, you say that now that she's here. But hey, now...
But giving an overview of the land, of the damage that has been done through the 19th Amendment, and why it's not just wrong against Scripture, coming from a biblical patriarchal perspective, but why it's never been done throughout history from any other nation. And any other nation that embraces such a view where you're putting women in charge of making decisions for a particular nation, that nation falls. And so,
well, since most of the world just recently hit the 100-year mark of letting women vote, and side note, I'm trying to figure out a better way to say that than letting women have the vote, as if women didn't fight tooth and nail for the vote. But since women had the vote, I guess would be the better way to say that. But you know what I mean. The last 100 years has seen the biggest growth in technology, in human rights changes, in scientific advances, in so many things. And I'm not saying that that's all because women can vote, but to say that every country that has done this has failed is so ridiculous and based on nothing. There's been plenty of women heads of state and political leaders throughout the history of the last 100 years, and many more years, that have been very successful. We have also seen country after country after country, led by men, come a-crumbling down. But this kind of guy doesn't want the truth. He wants his way.
So I think there's going to be a lot of evidence, a lot of research, a lot of even looking at women suffer more from women's suffrage.
There's going to be a lot of research about this. I have a hunch. There's no research that supports it, but there's going to be a lot of it. I could say that there's going to be a lot of research that pastors with beards are secretly really into My Little Pony. There isn't any evidence now, but there's gonna be a lot of research showing it. But I get it. The frustrating part about democracy is that some of the people who vote have a different opinion than you. And that's why you show people why your opinion is the right opinion. That's why you do campaigns. That's why you get out the message. You don't ban people who disagree with you from voting in order to get what you want. That stops it from being a democracy. But these people would rather rig the game to get what they want than actually show people why the way they want it to be is the right way to be.
The 19th Amendment has been a moral and political tragedy for America, but why? Women were not made to lead, but to follow and to feel.
If that's what women were made for, then why do these guys have to force it? If that's just the natural way, then they wouldn't need legislation to make it happen.
This is God's design, and it's good within the family and the household. But emotions cannot be what is used to rule and govern a nation.
That's why men should probably take a step back. Men like to conveniently dismiss fear and anger as not being emotions, because that way they can lead with emotions while saying they don't lead with their emotions. And if less world leaders would govern based on those emotions, we might actually have world leaders who are able to listen when they govern and make policy decisions based on what would actually benefit their people instead of what would vanquish their enemies or stroke their ego.
Basically, and generally speaking, women vote for whatever feels most kind or peaceful or safe to their emotions. Women crave security and comfort, and whoever promises those things wins their loyalty.
So his argument is that women are more likely to care about people, so they shouldn't be able to vote. And then the only bad things that comes out of it is that less people are being oppressed. They're the people that Dale doesn't like, so Dale is upset about it because the people Dale wants to be oppressed aren't oppressed as much. And there is a very good reason to not make laws based on a specific person's religious beliefs. He would not like it if there was a law that said he wasn't allowed to eat bacon because other religions say you can't eat bacon. He wouldn't like it if there was a law that said he's never allowed to cut his hair because that's a rule in another religion.
The problem is evil men know this and they exploit it. For example,
well, if it's the evil men who are exploiting them, let's just put the women in charge. If the problem is men, then maybe get them out of there.
Women are twice as likely to men to be seduced into an affair. They are 26% more likely to be financially scammed online. They are 3 times more likely to fall prey to psychics and tarot card readings and astrology and mediums.
And men are more likely to fall for romance scams, crypto scams. They're more likely to buy fake tickets to events. They're more likely to become fundamentalist creeps. Statistically, men and women have the same chance to be scammed. They're just different scams that work on them. Also, though, men are far more likely to commit violent crimes, including sex crimes. Most mass shooters and serial killers are white men. Do we really want to keep giving the people more likely to commit violence the nuclear codes? Is that a good idea?
The same emotional vulnerability that shows up there also shows up in politics. Many call it suicidal empathy. So I believe that we should return to the household vote, where women share their thoughts with their fathers or their husbands, and the men in their life make the final decision. Men are not perfect, but they are far more fit to rule with logic, and they are less likely to be deceived in political matters.
Oh yeah, totally. The logic of men. It's why men make the best leaders, because of all the logic.
I never understood wind, and I know windmills very much. Wind is a disaster. Any country with windmills is a loser, okay? And they say the noise causes cancer. You tell me that one, okay? You know, the windmills are driving the whales crazy. Those big windmills are so pathetic and so bad.
Giant, with arms 6 miles long. She is in terrible danger. It's a windmill.
So, I don't believe that we should repeal the 19th Amendment because I don't love women. I believe we should repeal the 19th Amendment because I love America and I love American women enough to protect them and our nation from their political exploitation.
Yeah, because men are never exploited. Men's rights advocates, pickup artistry, incels, alpha male pseudoscience, you know, stuff that actually does damage and actually causes violence against women, mass shootings, and men looking like dweebs.
If we had a Christian nation and women could vote, then within 50 years, we would no longer have a Christian nation.
Which is why it's pretty awesome that women can vote. This video has so many shit-eating grins, but that has to be the shit-eatiest of all of them.
That God has not designed women for warfare. And that's part of what politics is. It's really all that politics is. It's war without the blood. It's 2 disagreeing parties. You go and rally your troops, everybody who agrees with you. I'll go and rally mine. And then we'll come to the battlefield. And right before the bullets start to fly, we'll stop. And instead of fighting, we'll count. And whoever has the bigger army, they win. And the other army has to surrender and go with their decision, but then everybody gets to go home and live.
Thinking of everything in terms of violence and bloodshed is not a way to do things. Politics is not war, it's decision-making. Kingdoms or nations or cities or tribes have always had to make decisions about how to run their country, etc. Sure, sometimes there was infighting and violence, but traditionally it was solved by having advisors, but then the king or the leader of that group would make the final decision. Democracy isn't about replacing war with votes. It's about replacing one person having the final say with a voting system.
But that's what politics is. It is war. And I believe that the sword has been given to men. The sword is, without being crude, I think this is a fact. It is a phallus.
So he's literally saying that we should think with our dicks, and he wants to be taken seriously. These people are clowns. Well, no, I take that back. I have way too much respect for clowning as an art form. Let's see, if I was to go by the circus, these guys are the geeks. They don't really have talent, but they're willing to do really disgusting stuff in order to get attention. So yeah, he's saying that swords are dicks, so men are automatically warriors. But also, if swords are dicks, what are cannonballs if not breasts? Really makes you think, doesn't it? Or maybe we don't make political decisions based on the shape of random items.
My hope was that it just became a seed planted.
Okay.
Because that is what happens, right? You have to realize that there's a quote. I don't know who said it. It was like World War II didn't begin in the battlefields of Europe, but on the desks and journals and magazines of the university.
I think the person who said that was Dale Partridge, or he's butchering it so much that you can't look it up.
Like the idea is that was that generation's form of social media, right?
Right.
And so it's like everything, gay marriage didn't start in the Supreme Court.
Correct.
It started, in articles and blogs and social media.
Gay marriage started in blogs and social media? Sure. And your uncle was just really good friends with his roommate, Jeff.
And so I'm going, well, you know what? I'm going to lay this seed down. And maybe in 15 years, we overturn the 19th, or we, eliminate the 19th Amendment. But it starts with videos like this that make people go, huh. And
But yes, ideas do have a tendency to start out small and then grow from there. That's why I don't want to listen to people when they say that this isn't a big deal, that this is just a fringe idea, because they know that. That's why they're doing it. They aren't trying to convince people that this is an idea that they should implement right away. They aren't even really trying to convince people to join their side. The goal right now is to convince people that this is something that they should welcome in as part of the conversation.
Repealing the 19th is not a, quote, serious policy prescription. Now, that means something that I'm worrying a lot of you are going to miss here. What it means is we don't actually think that we can repeal it. It's not a real thing we're advocating for, like, actually immediately. It's a thought experiment, which is what Dave says, and he's right. The point is that you have to be willing to ask these questions and have these discussions on a real philosophical level to be able to even enter into political theory.
But I think what people liked about the meme is I wasn't saying that I'm like initiating this. I'm not saying I'm running a campaign. You're not going to find a blog from me that says, death to the suffragists or whatever. Like, you're just not going to find that any of that. But if it's on the table, and hey, I would support that.
Yeah.
And there's so many layers we could talk about. This is stuff that comes up in like NSA classrooms. It's super fun, like to watch everybody talk about it. Let's talk about the history of the movement and when it started. And you got a lot of people that have already talked about practically what's going on with it, what good has come of it, what difficulties have come of it. You got, if people really kind of dialed in, Toby said the exact same thing I did. So a household vote is what we were all talking about.
But he didn't say it.
It's easy to see that these guys are just goofy, that they're very unserious dweebs. But the problem is that they are reaching a lot of other very unserious dweebs. And the American government is currently made up of a lot of very unserious dweebs. We've spent way too much time ignoring the dweebs because we didn't think people would take them seriously, but the problem is they have taken over. They are right. They can't repeal the 19th Amendment right now. But normalizing this conversation will cause other problems, even if they never make it to that point of repealing the 19th Amendment. It's already causing problems, and that's what they want. It will cause more sexism. It will cause more pushback to women in power. more pushback to women in the workplace. These conversations are so dangerous and should never be normalized.
And the second reason, which is that this is one of the topics that helps to move the Overton window. There was a time, say 20 years ago, when to publicly say what we've said about the 19th Amendment would have gotten us exiled from public life forever. That is not the case now.
Sure, it's just in right-wing spaces right now, and sure, it's just a small number who are actually holding that view right now, but the people who hold that view are welcomed with open arms.
In fact, if you look at the range of options that are being thrust at the political public, including proposals from the unstable who want to restore the reputations of Hitler, Tamerlane, and Ivan the Terrible, I find myself in the unusual position, for me, of being something of a moderate, being as I am a bit to the left of Jeb Stuart.
Yeah, but he's still at the table with them. And as the saying goes, if you have 10 people at a table with one Nazi, you have 11 Nazis at the table. It simply comes down to these guys hating women. But women don't seem to be the only people that they hate.
The people that you are describing when you're describing the average woman who's votes more emotionally, which, based on the issues important to women and the issues important to men, is true. As I've just said, it's not the main argument for repealing the 19th or for women not voting. But to say that the reason they're too emotional, like they can't vote because they're too emotional. Well, one, yes, you don't want them raising your children alone. That's why you have a father in the home, right? The child is only formed well when there's a father and a mother. If there's only a mother, you end up with all the problems that we see with single motherhood in the Black communities, right? You end up with all these problems.
Yes, they're usually also super, super racist. Recently, there was a Christian conference in Ogden, Utah called War for Normal. At the conference, a Nazi publishing company was allowed to have a booth. And as mentioned a moment ago, that means there were 11 Nazis at the table. Now, since this was a Christian nationalist conference, it makes sense that people were looking at Doug Wilson for his input.
I can't really talk about Nazi chic and the eminent frame without dedicating at least one section to the imbroglio that broke out over the Antelope Hill vendor controversy at the recent Ogden War for Normal conference. I just want to touch on a few things in rapid succession, and then we can go on to the larger issues. Antelope Hill is a publishing house that publishes and republishes reprehensible stuff. They were there at the Ogden conference with assorted Nazi stuff, and they also had a flyer that promised to connect you to even more reprehensible stuff. For example, there was a foodstuffs webpage that sells Zyklon gift gas hot dust, cornbread mix with a swastika on top, and a piece of a door from Auschwitz. In the aftermath of the conference, the news about this particular bit of fecal matter hit the electric rotating cooling device. Discussion ensued. In this whole gala episode, the Ogden conference organizers had obviously stepped on a rake, and there was clearly a need to provide a response to all of it. This was gamely attempted by Eric Kahn and Brian Sauvé. Their response to the controversy ran along the lines of, the conference is huge, the flyer was handed out to consumers, contrary to the rules, the conference was emphasizing a lot of practical Christian living, and so why are people assuming that Nazism was somehow a theme of the conference? Well, shall we walk over to the Nazi booth? I've seen a number of claims to the effect that the Ogden conference only had regular Christian folks there. What are you talking about? There were no Nazis there, man. There were no Nazis, man, except for that one sponsor. There were no Nazis, man, except for that one vendor. There were no Nazis, man, except for the Nazi literature. There were no Nazis, man, except for all 3 WBS videos retweeted by the Ogden men. We are dealing with a form of non-Euclidean logic, by which is meant that if you don't count the Nazis, there were no Nazis.
And fair enough. Good for him for calling it out. That's what you should do. But the problem is he doesn't have the best views when it comes to race. Trevor, why are you talking about racism? Isn't this video about women voting? Yeah. It's all connected. Stay with me.
If someone says, well, I'm for social justice because I'm for justice, well, that's way too simplistic, because you have to ask what particular worldview is being advanced by the people who use the term social justice. Would I agree that Black Lives Matter? Well, of course I would. Right. But the phrase Black Lives Matter is associated with a particular movement, a particular group that I wouldn't want to be associated with, even though I agree with the content of the phrase.
No, the reason so many people didn't want to say the phrase Black Lives Matter is because they didn't believe it. If they say Black Lives Matter, they think that means that white lives don't matter because they are used to privilege. They are used to their power being predicated on keeping others down. So anyone else who has autonomy, dignity, or power is seen as an attack on them because that's how they have maintained their power. So they automatically get defensive when it comes to things like race.
We are the ones being arrested for speaking out at school board meetings, misappropriate scripture, like demanding we mask up to love our neighbor, encourage acts of aggression, racism, and hatred, like defending those who burned down a large chunk of Minneapolis. No, the beast did not emerge from the darkness in 2020. What happened was that a lot of people got tired of the beast rampaging through our villages, as it had for decades, and started looking around for a St. George.
I'll always defend those people. And here's why. Because from my white friends and family in 2020, I saw way more outrage about property damage in the protests than I ever did about the killing of so many Black people by the police. And I think we all need to sit with that. Why are you more upset about an insured Starbucks window being smashed than you are about a human life being lost? White people riot when they lose a sports game. Black people do it when they are sick and tired of their family and friends being murdered in cold blood and their killers being praised in the media.
Certain levels of such prejudice are actually beneficial. I rise to speak in praise of prejudice. You cannot outlaw all preconceived notions, and if you try, then the compliant among us will surrender all the positive ones, and you will be left with all the outlawed negative ones. When prejudices are outlawed, only outlaws will have prejudices. But the woke among us are nevertheless hard at work problematizing everything, and if they have their way, then white audiences loving a black soloist will soon be as racist as blackface minstrel shows. So when the woke are done with their demolition work, the only people willing to utter any sort of prejudicial thought out loud will be the neo-Nazis. And I will stare at the woke with my best fat face and say, don't look at me, this is your work. You can get decent middle-class folk to stop saying wetback, but you can't do it without unleashing the whirlwind. But this leads us back.
Jesus fucking Christ. Wetback? That's the hill he's going to die on? And there he was, in a roundabout way, defending Nazis. And he wonders why the Nazis love his movement.
Christians of goodwill who are black and white have to be willing to sit down with each other, have to be willing to both hear the other guy out, understand that the forgiveness of Christ encompasses all of it, and each side, I think, has to disavow its skunks and scoundrels, right? So if I can't go into a racial reconciliation meeting and not disavow the white supremacists and not disavow the Ku Kluxers. I've got to be prepared to say that's not what Jesus is all about. That's antithetical to the gospel. I have to disavow that in order to have a place at the table. And I want the black guys on the other side of the table to disavow Obama. And if you're not prepared to say that Obama is a major part of the problem, then you're not serious about racial reconciliation. And he
talks extensively in this video about how black people need to forgive white people for their past and to stop bringing things up that happened a long time ago. But he can't let go of the past.
Right. So a paleo-Confederate says, look, I think that Lincoln was a centralizer. I think that the post-war amendments to the Constitution inverted the meaning of the Constitution. Before the war, the Constitution placed restrictions on the power of the federal government. After the war, those amendments became means by which the federal government suppressed the power of the states. There was a fundamental shift that was brought about by that war. And nothing is advanced if we tell ourselves stories about, if we deny that happened.
Right.
And he's referring to the 14th and 15th Amendment here, the one that freed the slaves and the one that allowed black men to vote.
It's pretty simple, actually, and comes in two parts. All that is necessary is for someone to affirm that someone like Philemon could exist in the first century, being both a slave owner and someone who walked with God. He could own slaves in that time, provided he followed the biblical instructions and was careful to treat his slaves with equity, Colossians 4:1. The second part is to affirm that someone just like Philemon could have lived in Alabama in 1850. He could own slaves, treat them biblically, and walk with God. If someone refuses to do this, then they might want to call themselves an inerrantist. But whatever they call it, it is just posturing. The Bible, the New Testament, talks an awful lot about how to handle a social problem of slavery when you have masters who are slave owners, Christians who are slave owners, and Christians who are slaves themselves, all in the same church. You've got Philemon and Onesimus. And when Paul tackles the problem of slavery in Philemon, his solution is not for Onesimus to chop off Philemon's head and march around with his head on a pike. Right. Right. His solution is to remember, Philemon, you remember you've got a master in heaven. Treat your slaves equitably, as he argues in Ephesians. And Timothy says, you slaves, if you have believing masters, work doubly hard for them. Don't, in other words, there's a real subversiveness there, aimed at the institution of slavery, but it is not the John Brown violent revolution approach.
So what's the difference then between, say, the abolitionist spirit that was in America in the 19th century, and then, say, the way slavery ended in England?
Well, see, that's the whole point. The abolitionist, the person who wants bloodshed, slavery ended and good riddance. This is the important part. Slavery ended in the West and good riddance in the Western world, everywhere else peaceably. Here, we killed 600,000 people in order to do it, and established a pattern of racial animosities that lasted, well over a century. And that came from disobeying how the Bible said to do it. So the problem is not wanting to labor for the elimination of slavery. Prior to the war, 5/7 of all the anti-slavery societies that existed were in the South.
Just like with the Black Lives Matter protests, he is more upset about the violent reaction to slavery than he ever is about slavery. But slavery is violence. The transatlantic slave trade and American chattel slavery was some of the most disgusting and violent things ever done in the history of mankind. The atrocities that occurred are so revolting, but he downplays that and talks about the good Christian slave owners because he is racist. Because all these guys are racist.
If you are not being called a Nazi, then you are not pushing against the post-war consensus hard enough. You're not. If you're not being called a racist, then you probably at some level have given in to anti-white discrimination.
If you are called racist a lot, it's probably because you are racist. If you are called a Nazi a lot, it's probably because you are doing Nazi shit.
Are you a Nazi, or are you just a regular Christian from the 1700s?
Well, it's not that one because it's 2026 and you can't live that long. And we haven't invented time travel yet.
We live in such a disordered and perverted time that the moment anyone brings biblical order to the sexes, you're labeled a misogynist. The nations, and you're labeled a racist. To politics, and you're labeled a Nazi. I often remind Americans that the left would call men like George Washington and John Adams and theologians like Jonathan Edwards Nazis if they were alive today.
Our values should change over time. Change is one of the most important things we can do. He's always talking about how wicked the world is, so maybe he should agree with that. He literally wants everyone to change. He wants people to repent. So he recognizes that the world can be corrupt. No, you shouldn't pine for a time when people were enslaved because of the color of their skin. You shouldn't pine for a time when it was socially acceptable to be a flat-out racist.
They don't understand that these are all normal positions from everyone like 100 to 120 years ago. G.K. Chesterton, he once said, quote, "Every generation is saved by a handful of men and women who have the courage to be out of date, end quote. And that's me, okay? I'm out of date. I often tell people that I'm not a Nazi. I don't follow Hitler's stuff. I'm not some secret Klan member. I'm not even like an extremist throughout most of history. I'm simply a normal Christian man from 1850.
It's not 1850 anymore. Catch the fuck up or shut up. And I personally am very happy that the world isn't like that anymore. And the world has moved on. And I won't sit silently by when people are trying to bring that awful stuff back. And he's saying that he's not a Nazi, but then he says things like this.
We don't have time to do a deep dive into the Weimar Republic in Germany, but at the fundamental level, after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany and left the nation in economic and moral shambles. And it was attacked from within by grossly immoral Jewish forces during the Weimar Republic. It was a period of like extreme degeneracy marked by homosexuality, transgenderism, widespread brothels, child prostitution, sexual exploitation of Christian children. Think about like the Epstein files, but on a larger scale. Now, it shouldn't shock any of us that Jews played a wildly disproportionate role in this attack on German culture and morals. See, Hitler's attack on the Jews didn't come out of thin air. Okay, there was a cause, there was an atmosphere built. The Jews had taken over much of the film industry. They've taken much over the media. And just as they dominate Hollywood today.
That's literally something only a Nazi would say. Like, you can't accuse me now of just calling anyone who disagrees with me a Nazi, because we have a video of him defending the Holocaust right here.
So meaning that if you go to the equator, and whatever countries are on the equator, and the IQ is generally lower on the equator than it is up north. And the reason it's lower is because you have generations of people who had more of a physical life than an intellectual life. And let me tell you why. So when you have no seasons, and you have essentially an easy food supply, there's no food storage. You have...
you don't have to innovate farming technology.
Correct.
Okay.
Right? Up north, where there's snow, there's 4 seasons, you have indoor life. What do you do when you're indoor? Well, you have intellectual pursuits. Music, literature, all those different things. On the equator, what do you do when you're outside all the time? Well, you have physical pursuits. And so what happens is the equator people produce highly specialized physical people. Now, what are all of our best athletes in the world? Where are they from?
Yeah, well, they're from the equator. Yeah.
They're from the equator.
Yeah.
And where are the strongest minds? They're not from the equator. The strongest minds are from the north. God has sovereignly assigned different stations and trajectories to different peoples for his glory. The Japhethites have been blessed to be enlarged in both territory and Christian regeneration. We see that in this passage. The Hamites have been assigned to a civilizational station of subordination and dependence. And the answer to this paradigm is not endless foreign money. That's not the answer to this problem. The answer is to return to European Christian colonization of African nations. When the left is pushing something, I'm almost always going to initially go, maybe it's wrong. So why is the left pushing interracial marriage so hard?
By the way, he is in an interracial marriage. His wife is Latina, and I feel really bad for her.
Are blonde women actually dumb? In the 1950s, Jewish directors in Hollywood began casting blonde women as ditzy sex objects in airhead roles. From Marilyn Monroe onward, this continued through films like Legally Blonde or Clueless, and more recently, Barbie, all of which also had Jewish directors and producers. But in 2016, an economist at Ohio State University researched the question and revealed that blonde women have the highest IQ among all hair colors. In fact, they were also most likely to be labeled geniuses among women. So what's this really about? Well, it's the same tactic used in Hollywood to portray dumb dads in the 1990s and early 2000s sitcoms, which is a deliberate way to deconstruct Western confidence in society and produce self-hatred. You see, white guilt and shame have been going on for far too long in America. And once you see who is behind the deliberate pattern of undermining Western confidence, the only rational response is to expose it and reject it.
If it talks like a Nazi, walks like a Nazi, you might have a Nazi. So why the detour into these guys being racist Nazis. Because it's not just Christian nationalism that they want. It's white Christian nationalism. Sure, they have a few token black men. Sure, they have a few women sharing their message about how the real thing is that they don't want to divide families. How it's not about removing the votes from women, but it's about household votes. But at the end of the day, they hate women. At the end of the day, they hate minorities. At the end of the day, they want a nation where white, Protestant, preferably Reformed Christian men are in charge. We already know that they've been targeting trans people, which were one of the first targets of Nazi Germany. We know they've been saying racist stuff. We know they've been saying stuff about impoverished people. And now they're introducing the idea of repealing the 19th Amendment. And this is for a few reasons. As they've said over and over again, they think that women will vote for things they disagree with. And that is certainly part of it. These guys have been talking for a long time about dismantling the Civil Rights Act and other policies that give rights to people. And they probably think it will be easier if they get women out of the way. But it is deeper than that. This movement is about hating anyone who is not a white, Protestant, preferably Reformed, Calvinist Christian man. It's about subjugation. When the Nazis came to power in Germany, they went from 37 women in parliament to 0. In 1933, they made schools change curriculums to discourage girls from pursuing higher education. By 1936, women were banned from being judges or prosecutors. By 1937, they were banned from being any type of lawyer. And they were quickly discouraged from being any doctors or other professionals. And they also tried banning women from science, but had to quickly reverse that because they realized they were only screwing themselves over by doing that. They taught that women should focus on the 3 Ks: Kinder, Kuch, Kirche, or children, kitchen, and church. Which sounds to me like it's pretty trad wifey. People get really upset with me when I compare things to Nazis. But what is the point of learning about history if not to learn from our mistakes? Not to make changes when we see ourselves making the same mistakes again. These guys are moving the Overton window already. They are being invited to the table. They are being taken seriously by people with actual power. In the 1990s, we heard all the time about the hole in the ozone layer, and we were told about all the dangerous chemicals that were causing it, and huge changes were made. Fast forward to today, and a lot of people look back on that and think that we are just being ridiculous because nothing came of it, and we never hear about the hole in the ozone layer anymore. But that is because it worked. We stopped using those chemicals that were causing it, and it is now healing. It's still there, but it's healing. And scientists think it will be gone by 2066, which is really good news. But because it worked, people think we were overreacting. I really hope people look back at me and others screaming about how the Nazis are taking over and how these people are like Nazis. And I hope they look at us and think that we were overreacting, because that would mean it worked. If nothing comes from this, it's because we stood up. It's because people did something about it. This sexist bullshit is taking ground now, but I believe we can reverse the tide by calling it what it is. Fucking Nazi shit. Hey everybody, thank you so much for making it this far. If you know someone who may benefit from it, send it their way. As always, I love you so much. Keep an eye out for Nazis.
Work, Sky Moon.